Meeting Rachel in her office, John laid out the details of his experience. She listened intently, her sharp eyes focused. "Are you ready to go public with this?" she asked. He nodded. "It's not just about my case. It's about preventing this from happening to someone else." Rachel leaned back, a determined smile spreading across her face. "Good, but understand, this will be a fight. They'll try to twist every word, paint you as an instigator. We need to be prepared." In the days that followed, Rachel helped John file a formal lawsuit against the police department, sparking a rapid chain of events. The news spread quickly, drawing in national media and sparking debates. Outside the police station, protesters gathered with signs and banners demanding accountability, their chants filling the air. John's story became a rallying point. Support poured in from activists, civil rights groups, and community members. But there was backlash too. Critics accused him of attacking law enforcement, and some questioned his motives, claiming he was out to damage the Bureau's image. At home, Rebecca watched her husband struggle with the mounting pressure. One evening, she found him reading through a flood of messages, a mix of both support and hate. "Are you sure you're okay with all of this?" she asked, her tone gentle but concerned. John looked up, offering a tired smile. "I have to keep going. Rebecca, if I stop, this whole thing just fades away. I'm doing this for everyone who's ever gone through it." Rebecca sighed, placing her hand on his. "Just don't let it consume you. Remember, we're here with you." As the trial neared, Rachel and John prepared tirelessly. Media attention was relentless, and John was asked to speak at several public events, further amplifying the case. On the day of the trial, the courthouse was packed. Reporters and supporters lined the streets outside, holding signs and chanting for justice. John knew this was no longer just his story. It had become a symbol for all those who had suffered similar injustices. Inside, the defense tried to argue that Carter and Evans had acted by protocol, claiming it was a routine stop. But Rachel's cross-examination dismantled their argument piece by piece, highlighting their failure to verify John's identity, their assumptions, and their immediate decision to detain him based on appearance alone. When John took the stand, he recounted the events with calm resolve, explaining the humiliation and anger he felt being treated as a criminal while on duty. His voice filled the silent courtroom. "This isn't just about me. It's about every black person who's ever been wrongfully accused. Everyone judged by the color of their skin. If it can happen to me, it can happen to anyone." The impact of his words was clear. Rachel gave him a nod of encouragement, and John knew he'd done what he set out to do: speak the truth, regardless of the consequences. The verdict and aftermath. The courtroom was tense as the trial approached its final day. After weeks of testimonies, cross-examinations, and arguments, the jury was set to deliberate. John sat quietly beside Rachel, mentally bracing himself for whatever lay ahead. The stakes felt overwhelming, not just for him, but for everyone who had faced the same biases and injustices he was challenging. The defense had tried relentlessly to downplay the incident, insisting it was a case of mistaken identity and routine procedure. But Rachel had skillfully exposed their failures, their refusal to verify his identity, their disregard for his rights, and the biases that colored their decision to arrest him without cause. Her closing argument reminded the jury of the responsibility they bore to hold the officers accountable, not just for John, but for the principles of justice they had all pledged to uphold. Finally, the jury filed back into the room, and John felt his pulse quicken. The room grew silent as the foreman began reading the verdict. "We, the jury, find the defendants guilty of violating Mr. Adams's civil rights through unlawful detainment and racial profiling." A wave of relief and validation washed over John as the words sank in. He had won, but it was more than just a personal victory. It was a landmark moment, one that would resonate far beyond the walls of that courtroom. He glanced at Rachel, who gave him a small, triumphant nod, her expression one of quiet pride. As the verdict circulated in the media, the public response was immediate and powerful. Protests in support of police reform spread to cities across the nation, and the story dominated headlines, sparking widespread debate. The police department, under immense pressure, announced a full investigation into its officers' conduct, and several other officers were suspended as the scope of the inquiry broadened. But for John, the victory was bittersweet. His life had been turned upside down by the very institution he had trusted, and he knew the struggle for change was far from over. The police department quickly filed an appeal, determined to reduce the impact of the ruling. While he'd won the first battle, he knew the fight for true reform would be long and grueling. In the weeks following the trial, John returned to a quieter life. Yet he remained a public figure, his story a powerful reminder of the work still needed. The FBI eventually assigned him back to active duty, though he felt the silent weight of the controversy lingering around him. Some colleagues avoided him, while others expressed quiet support. But John knew he had done the right thing. One evening, John and Rebecca sat on their porch, watching their children play in the yard. For the first time in weeks, he felt a sense of peace, though he knew the battle for justice was ongoing. Rebecca rested a hand on his arm, her eyes filled with pride. "You did it," she said softly. "You made a difference." John nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "It's a start," he replied, "but there's still a lot of work to do." They sat in silence, letting the weight of the journey settle. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting shades of gold and purple across the sky, John felt a renewed sense of purpose. His fight had become bigger than his own experience. It was now part of a larger movement for change, and he knew he would continue to stand for justice. No matter how long the road stretched ahead, the struggle continues. In the weeks following the trial, John felt both the weight of his victory and the lingering uncertainty of what would come next. While the court ruling was a significant step forward, the system that had allowed his wrongful arrest to occur remained largely unchanged. The police department's appeal made it clear that they weren't ready to accept the verdict, and they would do whatever it took to protect their reputation. John's life was no longer his own. His case had become a symbol, and with that came a level of scrutiny and responsibility he hadn't fully anticipated. Every day, the media bombarded him with requests for interviews. Activists reached out, asking him to speak at rallies. His name was now associated with a much larger cause, one that demanded systemic reform in law enforcement. But for every person who supported him, there was another who condemned him for challenging the institution. At work, John's colleagues reacted differently. Some were supportive, sending quiet words of encouragement or offering to stand by him. Others, however, distanced themselves, uneasy with the attention his case had drawn to the FBI. It was clear that his position was no longer as secure as it had been before. One day, as he sat in his office, his phone rang. It was Rachel Walker. "John, we need to talk," she said, her tone serious. "The department's appeal is moving forward, and I think we need to prepare for the long haul. This isn't going to go away quickly." John leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. He'd been expecting this. He knew the police department wouldn't take the verdict lying down. "What's the next step?" he asked. Rachel's voice was firm. "We need to gather more evidence. The defense is going to argue that the officers acted in good faith. We have to show that this wasn't just an isolated incident. It's part of a larger pattern." John nodded. He understood the gravity of the situation. His case was no longer just about holding Carter and Evans accountable. It was about proving that the issue of racial profiling ran much deeper than a few bad apples. It was about exposing the systemic flaws within law enforcement that allowed such practices to persist. Over the following weeks, John and Rachel worked tirelessly, compiling evidence from other cases of racial profiling and police misconduct. They interviewed witnesses, gathered footage, and built a compelling case that painted a picture of a broken system. They knew they were up against powerful forces, but they also knew that they couldn't let this moment slip away. Meanwhile, the pressure on John continued to mount. He was constantly being pulled in different directions: media appearances, community events, and internal FBI meetings. His family, too, felt the strain. Rebecca was supportive, but John could see the worry in her eyes. She was proud of him, but she also feared for their future. The toll it was taking on their family was becoming more apparent, and the long hours and emotional strain were starting to show. One evening, after a long day, John returned home to find Rebecca sitting on the couch, looking thoughtful. She had always been his rock, but lately, he could see the weight of everything bearing down on her too. "John, are you sure you're okay?" she asked softly, her voice tinged with concern. John sat beside her, his exhaustion evident. "I don't know, Rebecca. This is bigger than I ever thought it would be. Every day, it feels like there's more at stake." She took his hand, squeezing it gently. "I know you're doing the right thing, but I just want you to take care of yourself too. You can't carry all of this alone." He nodded, appreciating her concern. But deep down, he knew this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the countless others who had suffered from the same injustice, the same assumptions. He couldn't stop now, not when he was so close to forcing real change. As the appeal process dragged on, the tension grew. The national spotlight remained fixed on the case, and John's every move was scrutinized. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, but he was determined to see it through. His fight wasn't just for himself. It was for all the people who had been wrongly accused, wrongly judged, and wrongly treated by a system that was supposed to protect them. Then, one day, he received unexpected news. A major civil rights organization had reached out, offering their full support. They had seen the strength of his case and the way it had captured the nation's attention. They wanted to work with him to push for broader reforms, to take the fight beyond his case and into the larger conversation about racial justice in America. John knew this was a pivotal moment. It wasn't just about the trial anymore. It was about igniting a movement. The question was no longer about whether he could win, but how far he was willing to go to make a lasting difference. As he prepared for the next phase of the battle, John realized that he was no longer just a witness to injustice. He was a leader in the fight for change. And while the road ahead remained uncertain, he knew one thing for sure: he wasn't backing down. This fight was just beginning, a new chapter. The pressure surrounding John's case grew, and with it, his role as a symbol for a larger movement. He was no longer just fighting for himself, but for all those who had faced injustice. The media scrutiny was unrelenting, and his colleagues at the FBI began to distance themselves. John had become a polarizing figure. Some supported him, while others saw him as a liability. But despite the challenges, John remained resolute. His fight for justice had turned into something bigger, a national call for police reform and accountability. As the legal battle continued, he knew the road ahead would be long, but he was determined to press on. One evening, Rebecca asked, "Do you think it will ever be over?" John paused, unsure. "I don't know, but I can't stop now. This is bigger than us." Rebecca squeezed his hand. "Just promise me you won't lose yourself." "I won't," he replied, his determination stronger than ever. The fight for justice was just beginning, and John knew he couldn't back down now. The rally for change. The weeks after the trial verdict were filled with a whirlwind of emotions, media attention, and political maneuvering. John's name had become synonymous with the fight for justice, racial equality, and police reform. Yet, as the movement gained momentum, John found himself wrestling with the exhaustion that came with being thrust into the public eye. Every decision, every action, seemed to be scrutinized under a microscope, and it weighed heavily on him. But amidst the pressure, a phone call came that would redefine the next phase of his fight. The civil rights group supporting him had successfully organized a massive rally in Washington, D.C., aimed at demanding nationwide police reform. The rally wasn't just about his personal case. It was a collective cry for justice from all those who had been victimized by the system. It was about ensuring that no one else had to face the same kind of injustice John had endured. John had never imagined that his story would reach this level, that it would ignite such a movement. The thought of standing at the center of it, speaking to thousands, was overwhelming, but he knew it was time to take this next step. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the entire system that had failed so many. As the date of the rally approached, John spent countless hours preparing, consulting with Rachel and the civil rights group. He had always been a man of action, but now He had to become a leader. His role was no longer just about pursuing justice for his own wrongful arrest. It was about pushing for a fundamental shift in how law enforcement operated across the country. The day of the rally arrived, and John, along with Rebecca, stood in front of the massive crowd gathered in Washington, D.C. The air was thick with energy as speakers before him shared their stories of pain, resilience, and hope. People from all walks of life had come together, their voices united in the call for change. As John stepped up to the microphone, his heart pounded in his chest. The crowd grew silent, waiting for his words. He had spoken in front of many before, but this moment felt different. This wasn't just a speech. It was a defining moment for a movement that had the potential to reshape the future. He took a deep breath and began. "This isn't just my story," John said, his voice strong and clear. "This is the story of every person who has ever been stopped, judged, and mistreated because of the color of their skin. This is the story of all those who have been unjustly accused, not because of what they've done, but because of who they are. And it's time we put an end to it." The crowd erupted in applause, their cheers deafening. But John wasn't done. He knew that his words were just the beginning. For too long, the system has allowed this to happen. For too long, we've allowed fear and bias to dictate who gets justice and who gets judged. But today, we stand together to demand change. We will no longer be silent. We will no longer allow the system to treat us like criminals based on nothing more than our skin color. The crowd's energy was electric, the sound of their voices rising in unison with his. John could feel the weight of their collective resolve. This was bigger than him now. This was a movement, one that couldn't be stopped. As John finished his speech, the rally continued with an air of determination and hope. The march for justice was just beginning, and John knew that this was a pivotal moment in history. His fight for justice had become a beacon for all those who had suffered. And together, they would continue to push for the change the country desperately needed. The road to accountability. The rally in Washington, D.C. marked a turning point for John. The overwhelming support from the thousands of people gathered there confirmed something he already knew. This fight was not just about him. It was about a systemic change that could reshape the future of law enforcement and the relationship between the police and communities of color. His words had ignited a flame, and the movement had gained a life of its own. In the days that followed, John became more deeply involved with the civil rights group, working alongside activists, lawyers, and community leaders to push for legislative reform. The momentum from the rally spilled over into the political sphere, where politicians began to listen. Bills aimed at reforming police practices started to be drafted. While John knew it would take time, he couldn't help but feel a sense of hope for the first time in months. The public was demanding change, and those in power were starting to take notice. But even with this newfound energy, the legal battle over his case wasn't over. The police department's appeal was still in full force, and John's case remained under intense scrutiny. The officers involved in his wrongful arrest, Carter and Evans, continued to deny any wrongdoing, sticking to their claim that they had simply followed protocol. Their defense team worked tirelessly to discredit John, portraying him as a troublemaker who was overstating the issue for personal gain. John knew that the battle for accountability was far from won. The police force had powerful allies, and there were those who would stop at nothing to protect the status quo. But he also knew that this was bigger than any one officer, or even any one department. It was about dismantling the systems of oppression that allowed such incidents to happen time and time again. One evening, as John reviewed legal documents at his kitchen table, Rebecca entered the room. The stress of the past few months had taken its toll on both of them, but she had remained his steadfast support. She sat beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "John, do you ever think about what happens if we don't win this?" she asked softly. John paused, his eyes tired but determined. "Every day. But I can't think that way. If I do, we'll never get anywhere. We have to keep pushing, no matter how long it takes. Even if we don't win, we've already won something important. We've forced people to listen." Rebecca gave a small nod. "I know, but it's not just you anymore, is it? This is bigger than both of us. We're fighting for something that will affect generations." Her words hit him hard. She was right. The fight for justice wasn't just about his case. It was about everyone who had been wronged, everyone who had suffered in silence. The movement was about making sure that no one else had to face the same kind of mistreatment, the same bias, the same injustice. As the months passed, the public pressure on the police department continued to build. The internal investigation into Carter and Evans slowly moved forward, though the wheels of justice turned painfully slowly. Meanwhile, John's case became more than just a legal battle. It became a symbol for the entire movement. He was no longer just fighting for his own dignity. He was fighting for the dignity of everyone who had ever been unjustly accused or treated as less than human. But John knew that change would not come quickly. The road ahead was long and fraught with obstacles. Yet, with every setback, every challenge, his resolve grew stronger. His fight had become a beacon for others, and he would not back down until the change he and so many others fought for became a reality. The final stand, months of hard work, media pressure, and legal battles culminated in a final court session. The police department's appeal had dragged on, but the momentum behind John's case had only grown stronger. As public support continued to surge, the officers involved in his wrongful arrest, Carter and Evans, were finally held accountable for their actions. A settlement was reached that acknowledged the systemic issues that led to John's arrest, and significant reforms were promised within the police department. While the outcome wasn't perfect, it was a victory, one that signaled a shift in how law enforcement would operate moving forward. John had not only cleared his name, but had also helped push for a broader cultural change within policing. In the aftermath, John found solace in knowing that his fight had sparked a movement for justice. The rally in Washington, his ongoing advocacy, and the public dialogue had created ripples of change across the country. Though the road ahead was still uncertain, John felt that the wheels of reform were finally in motion. He had given everything for this cause, and while there would always be more to do, he knew he had made a lasting impact. As he stood with Rebecca, watching their children play in the yard, John finally allowed himself a moment of peace. The fight had been long, but it had been worth it. His journey was far from over, but for the first time, he could see a future shaped by the change he had helped ignite. And with that, John knew he had not only found justice for himself, but had paved the way for a more just world for everyone. It was a warm afternoon in Southside Chicago, a part of the city that had earned a reputation over the years as a breeding ground for crime. Officer Mike Johnson had patrolled these streets for what felt like forever. He knew the area all too well. Every alley, every corner, every darkened street. It was a place where, to him, anyone who didn't look like they belonged was a threat. And in his eyes, the luxury cars that rolled through the neighborhood were the biggest targets of all. That's when he saw it. A sleek black Tesla gliding to a stop at a red light, its shiny exterior glimmering in the sunlight. To Officer Johnson, there was no way someone in this neighborhood should be driving such a car. He quickly flipped on his sirens and pulled up behind it, his mind already assuming the worst. The driver of the car, a young black man, didn't seem surprised by the police presence. He simply rolled down his window and waited. Officer Johnson didn't waste any time. "License and registration," he barked, his voice harsh, the words cutting through the air like a blade. The man didn't flinch. He reached calmly into the glove compartment, retrieving his documents with deliberate precision. There was no sign of nervousness, no indication that this young man was rattled by the encounter. In fact, he seemed completely at ease. As he handed over his documents, he met the officer's gaze without hesitation. "Good afternoon, officer," the man said, his voice steady and polite. But Officer Johnson didn't respond. He snatched the papers from the driver's hands, immediately scrutinizing them. He needed to find something, anything, that would justify what he was already thinking in his mind. This was a young black man driving a car like that in a neighborhood like this. Something wasn't right. There had to be a reason. He had to find a reason. "James Turner," he muttered, reading the name on the driver's license. His suspicion deepened. "What are you doing around here?" he asked, his voice dripping with disdain as he looked up at the man. "This car yours?" "Yes." Sir, James answered, his voice calm, his demeanor unshaken. I'm on my way to an important business meeting. A business meeting? Officer Johnson's eyebrows furrowed. He couldn't help but let a small, sarcastic smile form on his lips. A meeting? Huh, he said, the skepticism dripping from his tone. What kind of meeting would that be in a neighborhood like this? Driving a car like that? The contempt in his voice was unmistakable. But James didn't flinch. He remained composed, his hand steady as he calmly placed a business card on the seat. If you'd like, you can call the number on my card for confirmation. Sir. Officer Johnson glanced at the business card, but instead of making the call, he leaned in closer, his face hardening. You think I'm stupid? He asked, his voice low and menacing. You think I don't know when something's off? A kid like you, driving a car like this in a place like this? You must be up to something. James didn't break his calm, his expression unchanged. I don't think anything of the sort. Sir, I believe you're just doing your job, but there's nothing wrong here. A dry, humorless laugh escaped Officer Johnson. Oh, you're a smart one, aren't you? He sneered. One of those punks who think they can buy respect with money. But not with me. I know your type, always thinking you're above everyone else. But deep down, you're all the same. I think you're mistaken. Sir, James replied, his voice still even. I'm just trying to get to my meeting. There's no need to prolong this. Officer Johnson's irritation surged. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not in such a composed and direct manner. His gaze intensified as he tried to find any sign of fear or weakness in James. But there was none. The young man remained unshakably calm. Finally, the officer's frustration broke through. Without another word, he shoved the documents back at James. Get out of here before I change my mind, he grumbled, his voice cold and filled with annoyance. James nodded, his expression respectful. He didn't argue. He simply put on his sunglasses, started the car, and drove off without a second glance. Officer Johnson watched the car disappear into the distance, a gnawing feeling beginning to stir in his stomach. Something about the encounter didn't sit right with him. It wasn't just the car, or the neighborhood, or even the business meeting. It was the young man behind the wheel. The way he had handled the situation, calm, composed, unfazed by the officer's hostility. It bothered him. It bothered him more than he was willing to admit. As the sounds of the car faded, Officer Johnson stood there, still staring at the empty street. The encounter had ended, but something about it lingered in the air, unanswered, unresolved. The revelation. The next morning, Officer Mike Johnson entered the precinct with a sense of unease that he couldn't shake. The usual hustle of officers chatting and preparing for their shifts was slightly more animated than usual. But he barely noticed. His mind was still lingering on the encounter with James Turner, the young man in the Tesla. He tried to push the thoughts away, focusing on the day's work. But there was something about that interaction that gnawed at him. Something he couldn't explain. He had made assumptions. Yes, but the man's composure had unsettled him. For the first time in a long while, Officer Johnson didn't feel in control of the situation. That had never happened before. As he walked through the briefing room doors, he paused. There was a new energy in the room, an unusual buzz in the air. His colleagues were talking with a sense of anticipation that he didn't fully understand. They were all focused on one thing, the new police chief. Another one. Officer Johnson thought bitterly. Another bureaucrat coming in with grand promises, only to fade into the background just like the last one. He had seen this happen before. New faces, new titles, but nothing ever changed. His way of doing things had always worked, and he wasn't about to let anyone tell him how to run his beat. Then, as the officers began to quiet down, he saw him, standing before them, looking composed and confident in a tailored suit, was none other than James Turner. The shock hit Officer Johnson like a lightning bolt. His heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, time seemed to freeze. He blinked, unable to process what he was seeing. The man he had humiliated just the day before was now standing in front of him as the new police chief. James Turner, his new boss. Officer Johnson's mind raced. How was this possible? How could someone he had belittled, someone he had treated with such disdain, now be in charge of the entire department? James Turner, now Chief Turner, addressed the room with calm authority, his voice steady and strong. "Good morning, everyone," he said, his words echoing off the walls. "It's a pleasure to be here and to work with such an experienced team. I know each of you has a long career and much to teach, and I'm eager to learn from all of you." His words should have been inspiring, but for Officer Johnson, they only served to intensify his confusion. The man who had remained unfazed under his scrutiny yesterday was now leading the entire department. How had this happened? What kind of twisted fate was this? James gave a brief glance at Officer Johnson, their eyes meeting for a moment. It wasn't a look of resentment or anger. There was no triumph in his gaze, no sense of superiority, just a quiet, knowing look before he turned his attention back to the rest of the officers. After the meeting, Officer Johnson's legs felt like they were made of lead as he walked to his desk. His mind was spinning. He didn't know what to think anymore. The whole situation was unreal. But what was even more unsettling was how calm Chief Turner had remained. There was no sign of resentment for the way Officer Johnson had treated him. Nothing. The man was composed, unshaken, as if yesterday's incident had never happened. Before Officer Johnson could sit down, he heard the familiar voice of Chief Turner calling his name. "Officer Johnson," Chief Turner said, his voice measured but firm. "I'd like a word with you in my office." "Please." A chill ran down Officer Johnson's spine. He swallowed hard, feeling the weight of his throat tighten. "Of course, sir," he replied, his voice betraying his anxiety more than he would have liked. He followed Chief Turner down the hallway, each step feeling heavier than the last. He had no idea what was about to happen. What did Turner want with him? Surely, it was just a brief conversation. After all, he was still an officer, and Turner was his superior now. But something told him that this wouldn't be a typical meeting. When they arrived at the office, Chief Turner gestured for Officer Johnson to sit. As he did, Officer Johnson tried to maintain his composure, but his hands felt clammy, his heart racing in his chest. He could feel his palms sweating as he shifted uncomfortably in the chair. Chief Turner didn't immediately speak. Instead, he opened a folder on his desk, flipping through the pages with a focused, measured calm. Officer Johnson couldn't help but wonder what was in the folder, what had brought him here. Finally, Chief Turner looked up at him. The silence between them seemed to stretch out, suffocating. "Mike," Chief Turner began, his voice calm, yet carrying a weight that made Officer Johnson sit up straighter. "There's something you should know." He slid a dossier across the desk, and Officer Johnson's hands shook slightly as he took it. He opened the file, his eyes scanning the contents. The words on the pages didn't make sense at first, but as he continued reading, a cold realization began to settle in. It was an old case, a high-profile drug bust from 15 years ago. Officer Johnson's mind clicked into place. He recognized the name, the suspect, Samuel Turner. It couldn't be. He had arrested Samuel Turner, the father of the man sitting across from him, the man he had humiliated yesterday. As he read through the case file, Officer Johnson's heart sank. He could see it clearly now. The case was full of holes. The evidence was circumstantial at best, and there were glaring mistakes in the investigation. The trial had been a rushed, sloppy attempt to close the case. And now, 15 years later, the truth was undeniable. Samuel Turner had been innocent. The realization hit Officer Johnson like a punch to the gut. He could hardly breathe as his mind raced. How could he have missed it? How could he have been so blind? He had been so sure of himself back then, so convinced that he was doing the right thing, when in reality, he had helped destroy an innocent man's life. And now, sitting in front of him, was the son of that man, the son who had every right to hate him, to seek revenge. Yet instead, he was offering something far more dangerous, the truth. "This man you arrested," Chief Turner's voice broke through Officer Johnson's spiraling thoughts, "was my father." There it was, the words that shattered everything. Officer Johnson was speechless. The weight of the moment pressed down on him like a ton of bricks. "You destroyed his life," Chief Turner continued, his voice steady but filled with a pain that was impossible to ignore. "And you ruined mine." In that instant, Officer Johnson's entire career, his identity, Everything he had stood for seemed to collapse in on itself. The reckoning. The words lingered in the air, suffocating Officer Mike Johnson as he sat frozen in the chair, unable to respond. His mind was a whirlwind of confusion, regret, and disbelief. The man he had mistreated, the man he had so casually judged, was now his superior. Worse yet, the very man whose father he had helped wrongfully imprison was now sitting in front of him, demanding accountability. "I didn't know," Officer Johnson muttered, his voice weak, barely audible. He struggled to find the words. "I was just following the evidence." Chief Turner's gaze hardened. There was no anger in his eyes, just a deep, painful resolve. "You thought wrong," he said sharply, his voice cutting through the room. "You didn't just follow the evidence. Mike, you ignored the truth. You were so sure of my father's guilt that you didn't care about what was really happening. My father spent 15 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit. 15 years. Mike. And now you're going to face the consequences of your actions." Each word hit Officer Johnson like a physical blow. The shame, the guilt, the overwhelming sense of responsibility. It was all too much to bear. He had spent years thinking of himself as a protector of the law, someone who had done his duty. But now, confronted with the truth, he realized just how blind he had been, how much harm he had caused without even realizing it. "I never meant for it to happen this way," Officer Johnson stammered, his voice cracking with regret. He reached out as though to explain himself, but Chief Turner raised his hand, silencing him. "I'm not here for your excuses," Chief Turner said coldly, his expression unwavering. "I'm here because things are going to change. You and others like you have gotten away with this for too long. The system protected you. It let you carry on without facing any real consequences. But that ends now." The weight of Chief Turner's words hung heavy in the air, and Officer Johnson could feel the walls closing in around him. For the first time in his career, he felt small, powerless. Everything he had built, the respect, the reputation, seemed meaningless now. It was all just a house of cards, ready to collapse at any moment. "We're going to review every case you've been involved in, starting with my father's," Chief Turner continued, his tone unwavering. "Every complaint against you, every instance where you've crossed the line, will be examined. If we find misconduct, there will be consequences. And trust me, Mike, we will find something." The words felt like a threat, but in truth, they were a promise. Officer Johnson could feel the reality of his situation setting in. He had always believed he was untouchable, that his years of service and loyalty to the department would shield him from any real scrutiny. But now, faced with the prospect of a full investigation, he realized just how vulnerable he really was. "I understand," Officer Johnson whispered, his voice barely audible, his eyes downcast. He knew there was no point in trying to defend himself. The truth had been laid bare, and there was no escaping it. Chief Turner didn't offer him any sympathy. "Good," he said simply, "because this isn't just about you, Mike. This is about fixing a broken system. It's about accountability, something you've avoided for far too long." Officer Johnson sat in stunned silence, his mind racing with fear and regret. He had always seen himself as a protector, someone who upheld the law and kept the streets safe. But now, he had to confront the truth. The law he had sworn to uphold was broken, and he had been part of the problem. He wasn't a hero. He was a product of a corrupt system. As Chief Turner stood up and gestured for him to leave, Officer Johnson felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The man who had once been an unshakable symbol of authority was now a mere shadow of himself, crushed by the weight of his own actions. "You can go now, Mike," Chief Turner said, his voice calm but final. "But remember, this isn't over. We'll be in touch." With those words, Officer Johnson left the office. His legs felt like lead, and his mind was a blur of guilt and fear. He had no idea what would happen next. But one thing was certain: his life would never be the same again. As he walked out of the precinct, his badge heavy in his pocket, Officer Johnson was consumed by the realization of just how much he had lost. The image of his career, his reputation, all of it was crumbling before his eyes. There was no escaping the consequences of his past actions. The next few days were a blur of tension and uncertainty. Officer Johnson was placed on indefinite suspension, and the investigation into his past cases began in earnest. The weight of the scrutiny was unbearable. His colleagues, once supportive, now looked at him with suspicion. The whispers in the hallways, the cold glances, they all made him feel more isolated with each passing day. But through it all, Chief Turner remained professional. He never showed any personal animosity toward Officer Johnson. There were no public outbursts, no triumphant speeches. He simply continued to lead, to push forward with the reforms that would eventually change the department. And Officer Johnson? He was left to confront the reality of his own failures. It wasn't easy. Every day, he was reminded of the mistakes he had made, the lives he had ruined, the innocent people whose stories had been buried under the weight of his prejudice. He had built his career on a foundation of false assumptions, and now that foundation was crumbling. The work ahead of him, if he was ever allowed to return, would be nothing short of a battle for redemption. But even that seemed impossible now. As Officer Johnson sat in his car one evening, staring blankly out the window, he realized that the man he had once been was gone. He was no longer the confident, aggressive officer who had once believed in the purity of his own actions. Instead, he was a man who had been forced to confront the darkest parts of himself. And the path ahead, if there was one, was uncertain. Would he ever find redemption? Or would he remain forever marked by the lives he had destroyed? Only time would tell.